What is up, people? There's a recent podcast between Alex O'Connor and Jordan Peterson. Now, Alex O'Connor is one of my favorite creators of all time. Very logical and thought through arguments on atheist topics. He's got some videos on veganism too, if you're interested in that. But I want to talk about his conversation with Jordan Peterson. Now, we all know Jordan Peterson. He is the Sadhguru of the West. That's what I like to call him. Of course, there are similarities and differences. Of course, the people who don't like it when I make that comparison will say so in the comments. But I've explained why I'm saying that in a video I made about Jordan Peterson on the main channel, link to the channel below. But Jordan Peterson, we all know he's a believing Christian. But Jordan Peterson is also, on top of all that, a huge hypocrite. The reason I say that is one of his rules in his 12 Rules of Life, he wrote a book called 12 Rules for Life. And one of those rules is be precise in your speech. And that makes sense, right? If you want to say exactly what you're thinking, if your thoughts lead to conclusions that make a lot of sense to you, then you have to be able to communicate that to someone else to show what conclusions you come to. Now, someone who says that, when he is asked the question, do you literally believe in the resurrection of Christ or any other event in the Bible, he'll obfuscate his statement so much, he'll confuse the other person so much with what he says. Like, he'll constantly be like, what the hell does historically factually actually mean? Basically, he won't answer that particular question on do you believe in the factuality of the events in the Bible. He'll never answer it straight. For someone who says be precise in your speech, not answering it straight is... So I'll tell you why people ask this question and why Jordan Peterson sometimes confuses, and Alex here rightly points that out too. And Jordan Peterson, we'll just watch the podcast. Let's not drag this on for longer. Let's watch the podcast.
Well, what does it mean historically that the Spirit of God brooded upon the primordial waters? Like, what does that mean historically? Well, no one knows.
I agree.
What that means historically.
I don't think that at least most of Genesis or parts of Genesis are supposed to be. I mean, the Bible is a library, right? It's not a book, and that means that it's going to contain different genres.
That's for sure.
And so when
and some of them are more historically accurate, and some of them tilt more towards that kind of elusive. I don't mean elusive I mean ALLUSIV.
Elusive, yeah, sure.
Right. That elusive and symbolic form that characterizes Genesis 1.
I mean, this is nothing but word salad. Maybe it carries a lot of meaning to him personally, but unless you're able to communicate what you're thinking to someone else, whatever you're saying is completely pointless and beats the purpose. No matter how verbose, how many words you use, how articulate you are in stating whatever it is you want to state, unless what you're saying meets its purpose, it's kind of useless. I should have my pseudoscience bingo card over here. I should mark word salad. But let's watch.
Because there are different genres here, it depends on what story we're talking about. And I think that what I often observe you doing is we might talk about Christianity, and if you aren't comfortable committing to a historical ideal, you'll start talking about the Spirit moving over the face of the waters, which is obviously a much more mythological ideal, and not quite equivocating them, but moving between them too quickly and not delineating them enough. So if I asked you, do you think that the Spirit moved across the face of the waters, and you said to me something like, I think it's still happening.
Right, that is what I would say.
Hey, fair enough. Yeah, that makes sense.
It always happens. It happened at the beginning of time, and it's always happening.
When somebody...
Okay, we just saw Alex pointing out exactly what Jordan does, and we saw how Jordan speaks very metaphorically in a very confusing manner. The reason I think Jordan does this is because some people ask this question itself to know if Jordan is a part of their club or not. And Jordan says this himself in some part of the conversation. But at the same time, why Jordan doesn't answer with a yes or no for the question is because I think he knows how silly the answer sounds if he actually says it. If he says, I believe that a man resurrected from the dead because of the divine power of God, whatever it is, he knows how silly that may sound to someone who doesn't believe it. And so instead of simply saying no or yes, he will obfuscate, he will confuse whatever the other person to an extent where it's so vague that it makes sense to whatever the person believes, whoever is listening to it. See, I understand how Jordan is a believing Christian. And beliefs are not your conscious choice, they're more subconscious. You believe something, you become convinced of something based on the things you've seen and how much those things made you feel a certain way. So belief itself is not something you choose to do. So you can't choose to be an atheist or you can't choose to be a theist. Instead, what you do is you either are convinced or you're not, and that's not something you consciously do. It's kind of like falling in love with a person. You don't get to choose how much of even whether you love a person or not, but you just love them because of the way they are or some characteristic of them theirs that you really like, or if you're blood related to them and you're invested in their well-being, things like that. So belief is the same way. So I feel that Jordan believes in his theistic points of view, whatever it is, but he is aware of how silly it may sound if he says a certain thing like the factuality of the Bible, how silly it may sound to someone who doesn't believe the same thing. To keep his persona of someone who makes a lot of logical sense, he simply doesn't go to the extent of saying, yes, I do believe this factuality. That's it. So he ends up having to do this dance on that fence between the yes and the no. If he says no, then people will say, hey, he doesn't believe, he's been fooling us all this while. No, he doesn't want to do that either. So let's watch more of this.
Did the Exodus story happen? Did the Jews enslaved in Egypt break free of their slavery and move to the Promised Land across the desert for 40 years? Did that happen? You have also said, of the Exodus specifically, it's still happening.
Yes.
Now, to me, that's far more inappropriate than saying that the Spirit is still moving across the face of the waters, because I think what people mean there is, do you believe that these people in that time period actually did this in such a way that, for instance, might show up in an archaeological report?
Well, I think that's the simplest answer to that is probably.
Sure, and that's fine too. But
we don't know. There is, like, to the degree that there's been archaeological investigations in.
So probably doesn't mean we don't know. Like, we don't know is more like there's a 50% chance it could have happened, 50% not. So it's equal on both sides. But this is something you can say that it's likely to have happened or not likely. Instead of saying that, saying we don't know is a false middle ground fallacy.
The kinds of biblical narratives that you've described, the archaeological evidence tends to fall on the side of historical accuracy in relationship to the Bible, quite surprisingly often.
Clearly, you spent more time in Exodus than probably any person I've ever met in person, right? Clearly the story sort of captivates you and you think it's really important and can teach us a lot, right?
Yeah,
of course.
It's infinitely deep story.
I think most people speaking to you already know that you think that, right? And so when they ask you a question, when they suddenly say to you, but do you think it really happened?
Well, what the hell does that mean?
You must know that what they mean is what I was talking about a second ago, which is that sort of...
What? Okay, so fine. So it's easy just to turn this around. It's like, okay, what exactly happened in your historical account when Moses encountered the burning bush?
I don't need to know exactly what happened. What I need to know is
I'm not asking you specifically. I know. Or attacking you for that.
What I need to know is that if I sort of went to the Egyptian desert at sort of the time that this story is alleged to have taken place in history, would I see a mass movement of Israelites from Egypt into the Promised Land? Would I see people with feet walking through the desert, leaving footprints?
Well,
so Alex asked a similar question also about the resurrection of Christ. Like, if you were to go back in time and film that with a camera, would you see a footage of a man coming out of the tomb? He asked that too, but listen to how Jordan responds.
Let's take it apart rationally. So,
but you also understand that when someone's asking that, and even if you don't like the question, you must understand what someone's asking.
Oh yes, well,
and if that's
I understand many of the things that they're doing simultaneously.
Then you must also understand that when you then say it's still happening, people just go, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, well, I would say that's not my problem.
It is your problem. If you're not able to make sense to people, then what's the value you're providing? Why should people listen to you? Yes, it is your problem.
And that someone's asking a quite banal historical question.
Yeah, but you don't get to do that.
But why not?
Because the stories that you're dealing with aren't banal.
I agree, but
so you can't reduce them to something banal, even if it's what would you call it? Even if it's reassuring. This actually happened. Then what do you do with the burning bush? So this actually happened.
One comparison I would make is between this and talking about fiction more broadly.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you got it right earlier. I would say you noted that the stories in the biblical library leap across genres.
Yes.
Right. Well, we know this because sometimes they're poetry and sometimes they're song.
Epistles,
Yeah, exactly. And so in any given story, there's going to be historical account plus mythological overlay. And, you have to be a discriminating reader to kind of see what's different. And you don't just get to say, well, all the mythological symbolism is historical reality. It's like, no, it's not.
But here's the thing, for example. So like, take a piece of trivial fiction like Forrest Gump.
Yeah.
Right? We say like, okay, did that happen? Now, I think that what you'd probably say is something like, well, I don't think the events literally occurred, but I think that they obviously get at something that's sort of perennially true about human nature.
Exactly.
But then suppose I said to you, but hold on,
they happened. They existed as a pattern.
But there's a scene in Forrest Gump when I think he meets the president. Is it JFK at the time? I think he goes and meets John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And so I said to you, well, is JFK the like that specific part of that story? Is it true that JFK was the president?
Right.
And you would probably just say, yeah.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say anything more complicated. And even though the subject as a whole of like, is Forrest Gump true? Is Hamlet true? That's a complicated question.
Very.
But
Forrest Gump is fictional. So when you make this example, when you give this example and then ask the question, is Forrest Gump true? Even though there are true events like JFK being president, the whole thing is obviously not true. It's fiction. It's kind of like there are elements, some of which are true, but the rest are false. When you apply logic, when you apply an and. So a story is a collection of this and this and this and this, whatever. If one of them is true and the others are false, because of the and function, the whole story becomes false. And all mythology is like this. Just because there are true events or actual geographical locations in the story, that doesn't make the whole story true. It's a bunch of ands between the events of the story which make the whole thing false.
Specifically, when I say, but interestingly, there's this little point I want to make in this broader discussion. Do you think that JFK was actually the president? You would say yes.
Why do you think it matters to people? Like, I don't know. These are ancient accounts. Like,
maybe that's the biggest problem. Maybe that's the biggest problem that you have with people who are asking these questions.
It is.
And
like,
hopefully,
what point are you trying to make here?
So
the point is, I know what the point usually is the people who are asking the question believe that true in unerringly means objectively happened in history, like the things that we're seeing right now happen.
Yep.
It's like, well, no, that's not what those stories are like.
So that's that video. Hope you enjoyed watching that. I'll see you in the next one.